Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show from the Visma Lease bike training camp in Spain. Coming up this week, what was the hardest race of 2023? Which pro did the most kilometres and the most climbing? Velo Facts has been very busy trawling a year's worth of Strava data, and the results, I've got to say, are very interesting. I'll also be looking back at the first pro road racing of 2024. This week in the world of racing, we learnt that Mathieu van der Poel has now won 400 cyclocross races. This is according to Belgian cycling statistician Jonas Creteur, who's been counting since the world champion first competed in the youth categories. We also learnt that Juan Ayuso is now the new Strava KOM leader on the Col d'Airates. Now this is a segment that was once owned by Jonas Vingegaard, the Tour de France champion, who caught the attention of Jumbo Visma when he did it. Of course, he later got a contract. And finally, we learnt that you need to ride close to 40,000 kilometres in a single year to top the pro riders table. Velo Facts on X has once again been compiling end-of-year stats for all the pro riders, and it's the same name who has topped the table for a second year in succession. Lukas Osvian of Arkea Samsic uploaded a total of 39,366 kilometres of rides to Strava last year, putting him just a couple of hundred kilometres ahead of Lennart Turgels. He races professionally on both the road and on Zwift. Now the most recognisable name in the top 10 though is Michał Kwiatkowski with 35,597 kilometres. None of them, though, come close to the most amount of elevation gain logged in that year. That accolade goes to Sepp Kuss. He logged 652,853 metres of climbing on Strava in 2023, the equivalent of almost 74 Everests, or one every 5 days. Kuss uploaded 315 rides last year, meaning that on average, he ascended over 2,000 metres per ride. Pretty impressive, I'm sure you'll agree. It also means he rode more kilometres vertically than I did horizontally last year. Now that doesn't bode particularly well for the race I'm doing against Sepp Kuss very shortly. No, seriously, I'm actually racing Sepp Kuss and Jonas Vingegaard. I mean, stay tuned for that. It should be a real nail-biter. It was their teammate, Robert Gesink, though, who did the most amount of climbing per kilometre of riding. Whilst he ascended over 3,000 metres less than Kuss last year, his average climbing for each of the 30,000 kilometres or so he rode was 20.7 metres. That's effectively like doing 30,000 kilometres at an average gradient of 2%. The lad loves to climb. Prize for the most committed, though, goes to Megan Armitage. She logged a whopping 399 activities last year, totaling 1,168 hours in the saddle. That is just 4 hours short of Ovsian and an average of 22.5 hours per week. It puts her some way in front of Annemiek van Vleuten, who often tops the table on the women's side, of course. Armitage did 34 days of racing last year, including winning the Vuelta a Extremadura, so she's clearly someone who likes to train very hard indeed. Now I should of course point out that not all pros log all of their rides on Strava, so we can only go on what is available to us publicly. The other interesting stats that Velo Facts pulled from Strava were the easiest and hardest races of the year. Now this was based on average power of the finishers of each race, but based on that, the hardest race last year was actually the Memorial Marco Pantani. Now it's not a super hilly race, 2,600 metres of elevation gain over 193 Ks, but only 15 riders finished that day, with Lutsenko the first of those. The average power of those that finished was a whopping 325 watts. That's a couple of watts extra than the average for the finishers of the final stage of Paris-Nice. That was won by Pogačar, of course, and the US national champs won by Quinn Simmons. Simmons is no stranger to that sort of average power, as I will get onto later on in this racing news show. Of all of the Grand Tours in 2023, it was the penultimate day of the Tour de France that was the hardest by power numbers, 317 watts on average for those that finished that particular stage. At the other end of the table, we have what was my kind of race, the easiest of the year. Stage 1 of the Tour of Turkey tops the bill on that front. It took just 187 watts over 154 kilometres for the riders there, whilst the easiest World Tour race of the year was Stage 6 of the UAE Tour, which was a little tougher at 204 watts. Either way, most half-decent weekend warriors would have been able to stick with the respective pelotons on those days. What I'd like to know from you now, though, is do you know of any amateur riders who can match, or maybe even better, the distances or elevation gains of those pro riders just mentioned? There are definitely some people out there, so if you know them, you can let me know in the comment section down below. Incidentally, make sure that you check out our GCN Racing Twitter profile for some hot or not polls for the 2024 World Tour team kits. What we'll be doing is using your voting to compile the best and worst kits of this year, as voted for by you. So, if you've got a particular favourite or one that you absolutely dislike, make sure you cast your vote over there. I'll be running through them this time next week. Okay, let's get on to some racing now, because road racing is actually back. The new season kicked off with the Australian National Championships just last weekend, which saw a third straight victory for young Luke Plapp. He, of course, is now riding for the home team, Jaco Alula, but he rode away with teammate Chris Harper with around 100 kilometres still to go, and the duo crossed the line eventually 6 minutes ahead of everybody else. Harper at some point had to ask Plapp to slow down for him late in the race, and as such he let his younger teammate cross the line first. And it was actually a clean sweep of the podium for the team as well that day. Callan O'Brien eventually took the bronze medal there. Now Plapp also won the time trial just a few days previously, which makes him just the third elite man to bag both titles in the same year. Meanwhile, in the women's, Ruby Roseman Gannon added the road race to the Criterium title that she'd already taken earlier on in the week. She outsprinted Loretta Hansen to the line there, whilst in the time trial, Grace Brown retained her title for Groupama FDJ, but she was pushed close. Brodie Chapman was just 7 seconds adrift in second. There was a success for Jaco Alula in the men's Criterium too, with Caleb Ewan finishing things off after what was a perfect lead out from his teammates there. Cyclists now, and I can summarise the men's racing over the last 3 weeks by saying that Van der Poel won. In the much anticipated battles between him, Wout van Aert and Tom Pidcock, well, we haven't really had any battles. Over the last few weeks, he has won in Antwerp, Gavere, Diegem, Loenhout, Hulst, Baal, Coxader, and then again yesterday in Zonhoven. But it's been a perfect season for Mathieu van der Poel so far, 10 wins from 10 starts in races. All that remains for him now are the World Cups in Benidorm and Ogerede and the X2O in Hammer. And then finally the World Championships, which of course take place at the start of February. To be fair to Pidcock and Van Aert though, they have both been very clear that their goals are different this winter and that they're not currently on top form and weren't expecting to be. Either way, it's got to be a little bit demoralising, hasn't it? To not even push him close in a single event so far this year. In the women's, there have been a few different riders who have been able to shine over the past few weeks and take wins, but Fem van Empel has once again been the standout rider over the Christmas and New Year period. She won a total of 4 races in that time. However, she was beaten on 2 occasions. At the World Cup in Hulst, where she could only manage 4th, way below her normal standards. That was behind Puk Pieterse, who took the win, while she finished runner-up to the same rider at Gavere. In yesterday's race, Pieterse was locked in battle with Lucinda Brandt until the latter unfortunately had to abandon. She had a really nasty crash in which she fell on her face. So get well soon, Lucinda Brandt. So, in the overall Cyclocross World Cup standings, Eli Iserbyt still leads the men's, but his advantage over Joris Nieuwenhuis is now just 25 points. In the women's, Ceylin Del Carmen Alvarado has a more substantial 52-point lead over Puk Pieterse. Not an unassailable lead, but she's pretty much there by this point. International competition will now take a short break, with most national championships taking place this weekend. Right, on to some other news now, and I'll start with what I was talking about before, Quinn Simmons. He's been very busy training in preparation for the 2024 road season, and Atlanta Rouleur on X posted this paragraph of one of his training rides just the other day. This is what Simmons retweeted, and the numbers, I've got to say, are monster. So after a 20-minute warm-up, he averaged an incredible 340 watts and barely deviated from that for the entire 4 hours. With some under-overs at the end, it meant that over the 5-hour ride, he averaged 321 watts. Not too shabby. I can currently do that for a little under 5 minutes. There was some bad news just before Christmas for Giacomo Nizzolo. He unfortunately fractured his leg, and so his debut for Team Q36.5 is going to be delayed by quite a while in 2024. Some transfer and contract extension news now. Young German talent Marco Brenner completed the Tudor Pro Cycling roster towards the end of last year, while Sarah Giganti made a surprise move to AG Insurance Soudal Quickstep, if I can get my words out. That was after an agreement was reached between them and Team Movistar, with whom she was contracted through this year. Jonas Vingegaard, Sepp Kuss and Fem van Empel all signed contract extensions with Visma Lease bike. The Dane now until the end of 2028, and the other two, they've extended until the end of 2027. And there are also rumours that Julien Vermont might come back to the pro peloton and that he's close to signing a deal with Visma Lease bike, who've lost a couple of riders over the last couple of months. Lorenzo Milesi, the under-23 individual time trial world champion, signed a 3-year deal with Movistar, while Simon Geschke announced on social media just a couple of days ago that 2024 is going to be his final season as a pro rider. And just finally, both UAE Team Emirates and Visma Lease bike have already named their Tour de France rosters for this year. You may remember that the cycling world was pretty surprised just a couple of years ago when Jumbo-Visma announced their Tour de France squad on what seemed like it was before Christmas from memory. Anyway, it seems to be a bit more common these days. So, supporting Jonas Vingegaard at Visma Lease bike will be Kuss, Laporte, Kruijswijk, Tratnik, Benoot, Jorgensen and Dylan van Baarle. Whilst Tadej Pogacar will head to the Tour de France, having already competed at this year's Giro d'Italia of course, with Wellens, Pollitt, Yates, Ayuso, Almeida, Sivakov and Marc Soler. So plenty of climbing talent there, but as a lot of people have pointed out, that's a lot of responsibility on Nils Pollitt's shoulders on the flatter days. Right, that is all for this week. I'll be back at the same time next Monday.